The stagecoach rattled into Snake River, Idaho, on a scorching August afternoon in 1882, carrying a young woman whose inheritance would prove more dangerous than any outlaw's gun. Molly Owens pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, watching the ramshackle buildings of the frontier town emerge through the heat shimmer. At 22 years old, she had traveled alone from Boston, her mourning dress still crisp despite the long journey, her heart still aching from her father's sudden death 3 months prior. The telegram from her betrothed, Richard Pemberton, had arrived within days of the funeral, urging her to come west immediately so they could finally marry. After a 2-year engagement conducted mostly through correspondence, she had been eager to start her new life, to escape the suffocating sympathy of Boston society and the lonely mansion that echoed with her father's absence. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the general store, and Molly gathered her reticule, checking once more that the bank documents were secure. Her father's shipping empire had left her with a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi. She had written to Richard about the inheritance, of course. He was to be her husband. There should be no secrets between them. A hand appeared at the coach door as it swung open, and Molly accepted the assistance, stepping down into the dusty street. The man who had helped her was not Richard. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of river stone. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, weathered chaps over worn denim, a faded shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. A kerchief was tied loosely around his neck, and a gun belt sat comfortably on his hips. "Welcome to Snake River, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried the accent of someone who had spent his life under open skies. He tipped his hat politely, then moved to help the driver with her trunk. "Thank you," Molly said, looking around the street for Richard's familiar face. Her betrothed was a banker, originally from Philadelphia, who had moved west to establish a branch of his family's financial institution. His letters had been full of descriptions of the opportunities in Idaho territory, the fortunes being made, the future they would build together. "You looking for someone in particular?" the cowboy asked, setting her trunk down with care despite its considerable weight. "My betrothed, Richard Pemberton. He should have received my telegram about my arrival." Something flickered in the cowboy's expression, gone too quickly for her to identify. "Pemberton's bank is just down the street. I am sure someone there can direct you." Before Molly could respond, a voice called out from across the street, "Molly, my dear Molly." She turned to see Richard hurrying toward her, his suit immaculate despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in this town. He was handsome in a refined way, with carefully pomaded dark hair and a thin mustache. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to managing other people's money. "Richard," she said, relief flooding through her. After 2 years of letters and one brief visit in Boston before his move west, she was finally here. They could finally begin their life together. He took her hands, squeezing them briefly before seeming to remember propriety and releasing them. His eyes darted to the trunk, then back to her face. "You look well. The journey was not too difficult, I hope." "Long, but manageable." She smiled at him, waiting for more warmth, more genuine gladness at her arrival. But Richard was already signaling to someone down the street. "I have secured rooms for you at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable establishment. You will be comfortable there until the wedding." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "I have missed you." "I have missed you too," Molly said, though the words felt strangely hollow. She had missed the idea of him, certainly. The promise of a future, a partnership, a love that would ease the loneliness that had haunted her even before her father's death. A boy arrived with a wheelbarrow for her trunk, and Richard began walking her down the street, his hand barely touching her elbow. The cowboy who had helped her from the stagecoach was still there, watching them with an unreadable expression. His gaze met hers for a moment, and she felt an odd flutter in her chest before looking away. "I thought we might have the wedding quite soon," Richard was saying. "There is a circuit preacher due in town next week. It would be perfect timing." "Next week?" Molly felt a jolt of surprise. "I have only just arrived. Should we not take some time to reacquaint ourselves? It has been nearly 2 years since we have seen each other in person." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see no reason to delay, my dear. We have been engaged for 2 years. Besides, there are financial matters that require attention." Your inheritance must be properly managed, and as your husband, I would be in the best position to oversee those investments. There was something in his tone that made Molly's steps slow. My father's lawyer in Boston is managing everything currently. There is no urgency. But there is, Richard said, his voice taking on a harder edge before he seemed to catch himself and softened it again. Forgive me. I have been so eager to make you my wife, to have everything settled. The territory can be unpredictable. It would be better to have all legal matters arranged properly as soon as possible. They had reached the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure that looked sturdy enough, despite its weathered appearance. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying hair, welcomed Molly warmly and showed her to a clean, simply furnished room on the 2nd floor. After Richard departed with promises to call on her the next morning, Molly sat on the edge of the bed, her traveling dress suddenly feeling too heavy, too constricting. Something nagged at her, a discomfort she could not quite name. Richard had been perfectly polite, perfectly appropriate. Yet there had been something missing in his greeting, some warmth she had expected after their long separation. And he had mentioned her inheritance almost immediately. She shook her head, dismissing the unworthy thought. Richard was a banker. Of course he thought in terms of financial security and proper management. It was one of the qualities that had made him seem like a sensible match when her father had introduced them at a business dinner 2 years ago. Sensible, stable, suitable. Not passionate, perhaps. But Molly had never been a girl who expected grand romance. She had been raised to be practical, to understand that marriage was a partnership based on mutual respect and compatible goals. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the sounds of the town coming to life below her window. After washing and dressing in a lighter day dress of lavender cotton, she made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson setting out breakfast for the boarders. "You slept well, I hope?" the older woman asked, pouring coffee that smelled like heaven after weeks of terrible road-stop brew. "Very well, thank you. The bed was quite comfortable." "Good, good. Mr. Pemberton sent a message that he will call on you after lunch. Something about business at the bank requiring his attention this morning." Mrs. Henderson's expression was neutral, but something in her tone suggested opinion held carefully in check. Molly spent the morning unpacking her trunk and writing a letter to her father's lawyer in Boston, confirming her safe arrival. She found herself restless, unaccustomed to inactivity after the constant motion of travel. When lunch had been served and cleared, and Richard still had not arrived, she decided to take a walk through the town. Snake River was small but bustling with activity. The Snake River itself wound nearby, giving the settlement its name and its lifeblood. Farmers and ranchers came to town to conduct business. Cowboys drove cattle through on their way to railheads, and miners passed through heading to and from claims in the surrounding mountains. It was rough and raw compared to Boston, but there was an energy to it, a sense of possibility that Molly found unexpectedly appealing. She was examining fabric in the window of the general store when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the building. One voice she recognized as Richard's, tight with anger. "I told you it would be handled within the week. Have some patience, man. Patience does not pay debts, Pemberton." The other voice was rough, unfamiliar. "You said you had money coming. Well, where is it?" "She only just arrived yesterday. I cannot very well demand access to her accounts before we are even married. It must be handled delicately." Molly's hand flew to her throat, her breath catching. She moved closer to the alley entrance, staying out of sight. "Delicately," the rough voice sneered. "You owe money all over this territory. Gambling debts, bad investments, that disaster with the mining claim. Your bank is a shell, Pemberton. Everyone knows it. You marry this rich girl and get your hands on her money, or you will be run out of town on a rail if you are lucky. If you are not lucky, well, some of the men you owe are not as patient as me." "It will be handled," Richard hissed. "The wedding is next week. Once we are married, I will have legal control of her assets. I will pay what I owe, with interest. You have my word." "Your word ain't worth the breath it takes to speak it, but fine, 1 week. Then I start collecting, one way or another." Molly heard footsteps retreating down the alley, then silence. She stood frozen, her mind reeling. Gambling debts, bad investments, a failing bank. Richard wanted her inheritance. Not eventually, not as part of the natural course of their marriage, but immediately, desperately, to save himself from ruin. She backed away from the alley, her heart pounding. She needed to think. needed to understand the full scope of what she had just overheard. But first, she needed to get away from here before Richard emerged and saw her. Turning quickly, she collided with a solid chest and would have fallen if strong hands had not caught her arms, steadying her. She looked up into the face of the cowboy from the stagecoach, those river-stone eyes now filled with concern. Steady there, madam. You all right? You look like you have seen a ghost." "I am fine," she said automatically, then found she could not quite make herself step away from his steadying presence. "Just startled. I was not watching where I was going." He did not release her immediately, his gaze searching her face. "You are sure? You are pale as milk." Before she could answer, Richard's voice came from the alley entrance. "Molly, what are you doing here?" The cowboy released her and stepped back, his expression closing off into something carefully neutral. Molly turned to face her betrothed, fighting to keep her own expression calm. "I was restless and decided to explore the town," she said, pleased that her voice remained steady. "You were delayed, so I thought I would make use of the time." Richard's eyes flicked to the cowboy, then back to her. "You should not be walking around alone. This is not Boston. There are unsavory elements in a frontier town." "The lady seems perfectly capable of taking care of herself," the cowboy said mildly, but there was steel underneath the easy tone. "I do not recall asking your opinion, Nathaniel," Richard said coldly. "Do you not have cattle to tend or fences to mend? Just came into town for supplies, Pemberton. I will get out of your way." But the cowboy, Nathaniel, looked at Molly again, and something in that look made her feel seen, in a way Richard's gaze never had. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, his spurs chinking softly with each step. "You should be careful of men like that," Richard said, taking her arm more firmly than necessary. "Cowboys are rough sorts, not appropriate company for a lady of your standing." Molly let him guide her back toward the boarding house, her mind racing. The man she was engaged to marry, the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to wed, was courting her for her money, planning to take control of her inheritance the moment the wedding vows were spoken, and she had no idea how deep his financial troubles ran or what kind of men he was indebted to. Over the next few days, Molly moved through the motions of pre-wedding preparations with growing dread. Richard was solicitous and attentive, but now she could see the calculation behind his every gesture. When he suggested they visit the local lawyer to discuss how her assets would be transferred after the wedding, she pleaded a headache. When he pressed her about contacting her father's lawyer in Boston to expedite the inheritance process, she invented delays and complications. She was trapped. If she called off the wedding, she would be stranded in Idaho with nowhere to go, no friends, no support. Traveling back to Boston alone would be dangerous and expensive. But if she went through with the marriage, Richard would have legal control of everything her father had worked for, everything that should have been her security and independence. On the 4th day after her arrival, she was sitting on a bench outside the boarding house, trying to read a book but unable to focus on the words, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up to see Nathaniel dismounting from a sturdy bay gelding. He tied the horse to the rail and walked toward her, moving with an easy confidence that seemed innate rather than practiced. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat, "forgive the intrusion. I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." "That is kind of you, mister." She realized she had not learned his full name. "Zachary, Nathaniel Zachary, but most folks just call me Nate." He studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "You look troubled, if you do not mind me saying so." Molly glanced around, but the street was empty at this hour, most people taking shelter from the afternoon heat. "May I ask you something, Mr. Zachary?" "Nate, please. And of course. You seem to know Richard, Mr. Pemberton. What is his reputation in town?" Nate's expression grew serious. He was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. Finally, he sat down on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Why do you ask? Please, I need to know the truth." He studied her face, those steady gray eyes seeing more than she was comfortable with. "He is known as a man who lives beyond his means. His bank does some business, but there have been rumors for the past year, loans that should not have been made, investments in schemes that fell through. He gambles, and not well." Molly's hands clenched in her lap. Hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that made her stomach knot. "How bad is it?" "I am a ranch hand, madam. I do not have access to the particulars of his finances, but I know men, and I know desperation when I see it." He paused, then asked gently, "This has something to do with your upcoming wedding, does it not?" She should not confide in a stranger. It was improper, potentially foolish. But there was something about Nate Zachary that made her feel safe, made her want to trust him. I overheard him talking to someone in an alley a few days ago. A man he owes money to. Richard is in significant debt. He needs my inheritance to save himself. Nate's jaw tightened. I had a feeling it was something like that. When I heard he was engaged to an heiress from back east, it made a certain kind of sense. A man in his position, suddenly courting a wealthy woman he had never mentioned before. "We met 2 years ago in Boston," Molly said defensively, then stopped. Why was she defending Richard? "But we have only spent a few weeks in each other's company total. Our engagement was conducted mostly through letters." "Letters can hide a lot," Nate said quietly. "They can make a man seem like something he is not." What should I do? The question escaped before she could stop it, and she felt tears prick her eyes. I cannot marry him now, knowing he only wants my money. But I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. If I return to Boston unwed, I will be a subject of gossip and pity. If I stay here and refuse him, I do not know what kind of man he might prove to be when his desperation reaches its peak. Nate turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "Miss Owens, I am going to speak plainly, and I apologize if it seems forward. That man wants wealth, not you. He does not see you as a person, as a woman to be cherished and protected. He sees you as a solution to his problems, a resource to be exploited. You deserve better than that. Every woman does." The tears spilled over then, and Molly pressed her hands to her face, embarrassed to be crying in front of this near stranger. But Nate simply waited, patient and quiet, until she had composed herself enough to speak. "I thought he cared for me," she whispered. "Perhaps not with great passion, but with respect, with fondness. I thought we would build something together. I have been so alone since my father died, and the idea of having a partner, a family, it meant everything. But it was all a lie." "Not all of it," Nate said. His voice was warm, infinitely kind. "Your hope for a true partnership, for family, for love, that is not a lie. You just set your hope on the wrong man." She looked at him through her tears, seeing the honesty in his face, the genuine concern. "You barely know me. Why do you care what happens to me?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I have been asking myself the same question. Best I can figure, it is because I looked at you when you stepped off that stagecoach, and I saw someone brave, someone who had traveled halfway across the country alone to start a new life. I saw strength and grace and a kind of stubborn determination in the set of your chin." He looked away, as if embarrassed by his own candor. "And I thought to myself, that is a woman worth knowing. That is a woman who deserves honesty and respect, and someone who will put her first, not her bank account." Molly's heart was beating too fast. "We have spoken only a handful of times. I know, and I am not suggesting anything improper, Miss Owens. I just want you to know that you have at least one friend in this town. Someone who will help you, no strings attached, if you need it." "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes again, and the look in them made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Because it is the right thing to do. And because despite knowing you only a handful of days, I cannot stand the thought of you being hurt by a man like Pemberton." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Finally, Molly straightened her spine, wiping the last of the tears away. "I need to find a way to extricate myself from this engagement without putting myself in danger. Richard is desperate, and desperate men can be unpredictable. Let me make some inquiries," Nate said. "Quietly, so Pemberton does not get wind of it. I know people in town, people who might know more about exactly how much trouble he is in and who he owes. The more information we have, the better prepared you will be. That could take time. The wedding is in 3 days. Then we had better work fast." True to his word, Nate spent the next day and a half moving through Snake River, talking to people, gathering information. He was careful never to mention Molly directly, but he asked questions about Pemberton, about his debts, about the state of his bank. What he discovered painted an even grimmer picture than Molly had feared. Richard Pemberton owed money to at least a dozen different creditors, from local merchants to dangerous men who ran gambling operations and less savory enterprises. His bank was indeed struggling, propped up only by loans from larger institutions back east, loans that were coming due. He had invested heavily in a mining claim that had proven worthless and in a cattle venture that had been decimated by a harsh winter. He was drowning, and Molly's inheritance was not just a windfall, it was his only lifeline. Nate shared all of this with Molly in a quiet corner of the general store, where they could talk without being easily overheard. She listened with growing horror and resolution. If I marry him and he gains control of my inheritance, he will burn through it within months trying to cover his debts, she said. And then I will be penniless and bound to a man who resents me for not being an infinite source of money. You are not going to marry him, Nate said firmly. We will find another way. How? If I simply call it off, he might become violent. You have said yourself he is desperate, and even if he accepts it peacefully, I have nowhere to go. Nate was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. There is one option, though you may find it presumptuous of me to suggest it. What option? You could marry someone else, someone you could trust not to take advantage of your inheritance, someone who would give you time and space to grieve, to heal, to figure out what you really want from life. He met her eyes. Someone like me. Molly stared at him, her mind racing. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. I am not a rich man, Miss Owens. I am a ranch hand, and I make a decent wage, but nothing spectacular. I have saved some money over the years, enough to buy a small piece of land eventually, maybe start my own herd. I am not offering you luxury or social position, but I can offer you honesty, respect, and protection. We could marry, thwart Pemberton's plans, and then figure out the rest as we go. You would marry a stranger to save her from a bad situation? You are not really a stranger anymore, he said quietly, and I would be lying if I said it was purely altruistic. I feel something when I am around you, Miss Owens, something I have not felt before. Maybe it is the beginning of something real. Maybe it is just recognition of a kindred spirit. Either way, I would rather take a chance on you than stand by and watch Pemberton use you. Molly's thoughts whirled. It was madness, absolute madness. She barely knew Nate Zachary, but she barely knew Richard either, if she was honest with herself. And Nate had shown her more genuine care and concern in a few days than Richard had in 2 years of correspondence. What would happen after? She asked. If we married, what would you expect of me? I would expect you to be my wife in name, for appearance's sake, but I would not force anything on you. You would have time to decide what kind of marriage you wanted it to be. And if you decided eventually that you wanted something else, we could discuss it like reasonable adults. I am not trying to trap you, Miss Owens. I am trying to free you. She studied his face, looking for deception, for hidden motives. But all she saw was sincerity, and something that looked like hope. You truly mean this. Every word. It is completely improper and possibly insane. A smile flickered across his face. I have never been accused of being overly proper. And sometimes a little insanity is exactly what a situation calls for. Molly found herself laughing despite everything, a slightly hysterical sound that she quickly muffled with her hand. My father would be appalled. Boston society would have collective apoplexy. And I would be throwing away my chance at the kind of respectable marriage I was raised to expect. Respectable does not mean good, Nate said. I would rather be a decent man in worn boots than a scoundrel in fine shoes. She looked at him. Really looked at him. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong bones and sun-weathered skin. His hands were calloused from work, his clothes practical rather than fashionable. But his eyes were kind, his smile genuine, and everything about him spoke of solidity, of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. If I agreed to this, how would we manage it? Richard would never accept it peacefully. We go to the preacher first thing tomorrow morning. Reverend Matthews lives on a small farm just outside town. We marry there, quietly, with just a couple of witnesses. Then we go straight to the lawyer and make sure your inheritance is protected, that I have no legal claim to it beyond what you choose to give me. We can have papers drawn up, whatever you need to feel safe. Then we face Pemberton together and tell him the wedding is off because you are already married to someone else. He will be furious. He might try to hurt you. Let him try, Nate said, and there was steel in his voice. I am not afraid of a soft-handed banker, desperate or not. And once it is done, once you are legally married to me, There is nothing he can do to change it. Molly took a deep breath, feeling as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into unknown waters. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was madness, that she should find some other solution, some slower and more careful path. But her heart, that treacherous organ she had tried so hard to ignore, whispered that Nate Zachary was offering her something precious. Not just escape, but possibility. The chance to build something real instead of settling for something safe, but hollow. "All right," she heard herself say. "Let us do it. Let us get married." The surprise and joy that lit up Nate's face made her breath catch. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against her skin. "You will not regret this," he said. "I swear to you, Molly Owens, I will spend every day proving that you made the right choice. I hope we both can say that a year from now," she said, trying to smile through the terror and exhilaration coursing through her. "We will," he said with absolute certainty. "Trust me." And against all reason, she found that she did. They spent the rest of the day making careful preparations. Nate arranged for 2 friends to meet them at Reverend Matthews' farm at dawn, people he trusted absolutely. Molly packed a small bag with her most essential belongings and the documents related to her inheritance. She wrote a brief letter to Richard, explaining that she could not marry him and asking him not to contact her again. It was cowardly, perhaps, to not tell him face to face, but she could not risk him preventing the wedding through force or manipulation. That night, Molly barely slept. She lay in her bed at the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the town settling into quiet, and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the first truly brave decision she had ever made. Just before dawn, she dressed in a simple blue cotton dress, not the elaborate gown she had brought for her wedding to Richard, but something practical and pretty. She braided her hair simply and put on her mother's pearl earrings for luck. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a woman who looked terrified and determined in equal measure. Nate was waiting outside the boarding house with 2 horses just as the sky was beginning to lighten. He looked scrubbed and nervous, wearing what were clearly his best clothes, still simple cowboy garb, but clean and well-maintained. When he saw her, his expression softened into something tender. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "You do not have to flatter me," Molly said, trying to steady her nerves. "We are past that now. It is not flattery if it is true. You are beautiful, Molly, and brave. And I am the luckiest man in Idaho territory right now, even if this whole thing is completely insane." That startled a laugh out of her, breaking the tension. Nate helped her onto one of the horses, then mounted his own. They rode out of town as the sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Reverend Matthews's farm was small but well kept, a simple house with a barn and a few outbuildings. The Reverend himself was a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He was waiting for them along with Nate's 2 friends, a ranch hand named Tom, and the wife of the general store owner, Mrs. Patterson. "You are sure about this, son?" Reverend Matthews asked Nate, looking between him and Molly. "Marriage is a sacred bond, not something to be entered into lightly." "I have never been more sure of anything, Reverend," Nate said, and the conviction in his voice sent warmth through Molly's chest. The ceremony was simple and quick, nothing like the elaborate wedding Molly had imagined as a girl. But as she stood there in the early morning light, holding Nate's hands and repeating vows that suddenly felt incredibly weighty, she found herself meaning every word. When Nate slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, his hands gentle despite their strength, she felt tears prick her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews said. "You may kiss your bride, Nathaniel." Nate looked at her, a question in his eyes. Molly gave the smallest nod, and he leaned in slowly, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft and brief, but somehow more meaningful than any grand gesture. When he pulled back, he was smiling, and Molly realized she was smiling too. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Zachary," he said, and the name sent a thrill through her. They signed the marriage certificate, had it witnessed, and then rode directly into town to the lawyer's office. Hiram Dorsey, the local attorney, was just opening his office when they arrived. He looked surprised to see them, but invited them in. "What can I do for you folks this morning?" he asked, settling behind his desk. "We need to draw up papers protecting my wife's inheritance," Nate said, making it clear that it remains solely in her name, with no access granted to me without her explicit written consent. Dorsey's eyebrows rose. That is an unusual request for a new husband. I am an unusual man, Nate said, and I want my wife to feel secure. Can you draw up such papers? I can. It will take a few hours to draft everything properly and have it notarized. We will wait, Molly said. She reached for Nate's hand, and he laced his fingers through hers, holding tight. By early afternoon, the papers were signed and filed. Molly's inheritance was protected by legal documents that made it clear Nate had no claim to her money. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the hardest part was still ahead. They walked together back toward the main street of town, and Molly steeled herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. They did not have to wait long. Richard was standing outside his bank, and when he saw Molly walking with Nate, their hands joined, he went pale and then flushed with anger. Molly, where have you been? I have been looking for you all morning. He strode toward them, his expression thunderous. And why are you holding hands with this cowboy? Richard, I need to speak with you, Molly said, proud that her voice did not shake. Perhaps we should go somewhere more private. I have nothing to say to him that cannot be said right here, Nate interjected. Pemberton, Miss Owens is no longer your betrothed. We were married this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at them as if they had spoken in a foreign language. Then his face contorted with rage. You cannot be serious. This is some kind of joke. It is no joke, Molly said. She held up her left hand, showing the silver band. I am married to Nathaniel Zachary. Our engagement is ended. You foolish girl, Richard exploded. Do you have any idea what you have done? I have made plans, arrangements. The wedding is tomorrow. Plans for what, Pemberton? Nate asked, his voice dangerously soft. Plans to get your hands on her inheritance? To use her money to pay off your gambling debts and failing investments? Richard's face went from red to white. I do not know what lies you have been feeding her, but they are not lies, Molly interrupted. I overheard you myself, talking to one of your creditors in an alley. You are desperate, Richard. You need my money immediately. But this was never about me, was it? It was never about building a life together. I was just a solution to your problems. You do not understand the pressures of business, Richard blustered. You are just a woman. You have no concept of what it takes to maintain position, to manage finances in a difficult economy. I was trying to protect you. By lying to me? By planning to take control of my inheritance without my knowledge or consent? Molly shook her head. That is not protection, Richard. That is exploitation. Richard's expression turned ugly. He took a step toward Molly, and Nate immediately moved to block him, his body language shifting into something alert and dangerous. You do not want to take another step, Nate said quietly. This is your doing, Richard spat at him. You saw an opportunity and you took it. You are no better than me, Zachary. At least I am honest about wanting her money. Except you are not, Nate said. You lied to her for 2 years. You brought her all the way from Boston under false pretenses. I was honest with Molly from the start. She knows exactly what kind of man I am and what I can and cannot offer her. And she chose me anyway. Richard looked between them, his expression desperate now. Molly, please, think about what you are doing. You are throwing away your reputation, your social standing, your future. For what? A cowboy who will never be able to give you the life you deserve? He already has, Molly said softly. He has given me honesty, respect, and freedom. That is more than you ever offered me, Richard. For a moment, she thought Richard might actually lunge at them. But then his shoulders sagged, and something like defeat crossed his face. You will regret this, he said bitterly. Both of you. I do not think we will, Nate said. He turned to Molly. Come on, let us go home. Home, it turned out, was a small cabin on the ranch where Nate worked, about 5 miles outside of Snake River. The ranch was owned by a man named Jacob Morrison, who had built up a substantial cattle operation over the years. Nate worked as Morrison's lead hand, managing the other cowboys and overseeing much of the day-to-day operations. Morrison himself, a gruff man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp eyes, met them as they rode up to the main house. So you went and did it, he said, looking between Nate and Molly. Married the banker's girl. She is my girl now, Nate said mildly. Molly, this is my boss, Jacob Morrison. Jacob, this is my wife, Molly. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Zachary. Your husband is the best hand I have ever had. You treat him right, you hear?" "I intend to," Molly said, and Morrison's stern face cracked into something resembling a smile. Nate's cabin was small but sturdy, with one main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a smaller bedroom. It was simply furnished with handmade furniture, and had the clean, spare look of a space occupied by a man who spent most of his time outdoors. Molly looked around, trying to imagine making a life here, so far from everything she had known. "It is not much," Nate said, standing in the doorway and watching her. "But it is clean, and the roof does not leak. We can add on if we need to, maybe build a separate bedroom." Molly turned to face him, struck by the uncertainty in his expression. This man who had seemed so confident, so sure, was nervous about whether his home was good enough for her. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. "Nate, I want you to understand something. I did not marry you expecting luxury or social position. I married you because you were honest with me, because you offered me a choice when I had none, because when I look at you, I see a good man. That is worth more than any fine house or elegant furnishings." Relief and something warmer flooded his face. "I am going to do everything I can to make you happy, Molly. I know this is not how you imagined your life would go." "Maybe that is not such a bad thing," she said. "My imagined life was going to be tied to Richard Pemberton. This is better, even if it is uncertain." They stood looking at each other across the small cabin, the weight of what they had done settling over them. They were married, legally bound, living together in this small space. The intimacy of it was suddenly overwhelming. "I will sleep on the floor," Nate said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. "You can have the bedroom. I want you to feel safe here, Molly. I meant what I said about not forcing anything." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate that more than I can say." They spent the rest of the day in a strange dance of politeness and careful boundaries. Nate showed her where everything was kept, how the stove worked, where the well was for water. Molly unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on pegs in the bedroom and arranging her toiletries on the simple washstand. It was surreal, playing house with a man who was legally her husband, but was still virtually a stranger. That night, they ate a simple dinner that Molly prepared from the supplies in Nate's pantry. The conversation was stilted at first, both of them hyper-aware of the situation they had created, but gradually they began to relax into it. Nate told her about the ranch, about the work he did, about the land and the rhythms of life out here. Molly found herself genuinely interested, asking questions, learning about a world completely foreign to her Boston upbringing. "Have you always been a rancher?" she asked as they washed the dishes together. "Not always. I grew up in Texas, on a small farm. My father died when I was 15, and my mother could not manage the place alone. We lost it to debt, and she went to live with her sister in San Antonio. I headed north, looking for work. I have been on ranches ever since, moving around, learning the trade. I have been at Morrison's ranch for 3 years now. It is the longest I have stayed anywhere since I left home." "Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes. But this land gets into your blood too, in a different way. It is harsh, but honest. It does not pretend to be something it is not." "Like you," Molly said softly. He looked at her, something intense in his gaze. "I hope so. I never had much patience for pretense." Later, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, they sat on the porch of the cabin together. Nate had insisted on setting up a chair for her while he sat on the steps. The land stretched out before them, wild and beautiful, dotted with cattle in the distance. "Are you sorry?" Nate asked quietly. "About today, about all of this?" Molly considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I am terrified and uncertain, and everything has happened so fast that my head is spinning. But I am not sorry. You saved me, Nate. Maybe I could have found another way out, but you gave me an option when I was out of options. That is not something I will forget." "I did not do it to have you be grateful to me," he said, turning to look at her. "I did it because it was right, and because I wanted to. Because from the moment I saw you, something in me said this one matters." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "We barely know each other." "I know, but sometimes you just know anyway. I cannot explain it better than that." He stood, brushing off his pants. "I should let you get some rest. It has been a long day." That night, Molly lay in the small bedroom, listening to the sounds of Nate moving around in the main room, settling down for the night on the floor near the stove. She felt a pang of guilt that he was uncomfortable for her sake, but when she had tried to suggest an alternative arrangement, he had been adamant. She stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet. She was married. To a cowboy she had known for less than a week, her entire life had been upended, all her plans and expectations thrown into chaos. But underneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. A tiny flicker of hope, maybe even excitement. Nate Zachary was a good man. She could see it in everything he did, every choice he made. And if she was honest with herself, she was attracted to him in a way she had never been attracted to Richard. When Nate looked at her, she felt seen. When he smiled, she felt warm. When he touched her hand, she felt a spark that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Maybe, just maybe, this hasty marriage would become something real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Nate left early each morning to work on the ranch, and Molly spent her days learning how to manage the household. It was different from anything she had done in Boston, where servants had handled most domestic tasks. Here, she learned to cook on a wood stove, to manage supplies carefully, to make do with what was available. Mrs. Morrison, Jacob's wife Sarah, proved to be an unexpected ally. She was a practical woman with a dry sense of humor, and she took Molly under her wing, teaching her the skills she would need to survive as a rancher's wife. Under Sarah's patient instruction, Molly learned to make bread, to preserve food, to mend clothes properly. The work was hard and sometimes frustrating, but there was satisfaction in mastering these practical skills. The women of Snake River were more complex. Some were welcoming, particularly those who had never cared for Richard Pemberton. But others were scandalized by Molly's hasty marriage to a cowboy, throwing over her engagement to a banker. Molly found she cared less than she expected about their opinions. She had spent her whole life being the proper young lady, doing what was expected. It was liberating in a strange way to have stepped so completely outside those expectations. In the evenings, when Nate returned from work, they would sit together and talk. Slowly, carefully, they began to truly know each other. Nate told her about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could barely walk, about the pain of losing his father and then his home. Molly shared stories of growing up in Boston, of her lonely childhood as an only child of wealthy parents, of her father's love for his shipping business and his quiet affection for his daughter. "He would have liked you," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "My father, I mean. He valued honesty and hard work. He built his business from nothing." "I wish I could have met him," Nate said, "to ask his permission properly, the way it should have been done. I think he would have given it, eventually, after he got over the shock." She smiled, imagining her father's face if she had brought Nate home to Boston. "He wanted me to be happy. He arranged my meeting with Richard because he thought a banker would be a stable, suitable match. But he always said that ultimately the choice was mine." "And you chose me," Nate said, wonder still evident in his voice. "I chose you," she confirmed. As weeks passed, the careful boundaries between them began to shift. It started small, a hand on the small of her back as Nate helped her over rough ground, his arm around her shoulders when they sat together in the evenings and the air grew cool. Molly reaching out to brush dust from his shirt when he came in from work. Each touch was deliberate, acknowledged, building something between them that was equal parts friendship and attraction. One evening, about a month after their wedding, Nate came home to find Molly in tears over a burnt dinner. She had been trying to prepare something special, a recipe Sarah had taught her, but she had gotten distracted and let it burn. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her face. "I know food is not cheap out here, and I wasted it." "Hey, it is all right," Nate said, pulling her into his arms without hesitation. "It is just food. We can open some canned goods. It is not the end of the world." But Molly found she could not stop crying. The burnt dinner was not really the problem. It was everything. The strangeness of this life, the uncertainty about their future, the growing feelings for Nate that terrified her because they were becoming so real, so important. "Talk to me," Nate said gently, guiding her to sit down and crouching in front of her, his hands holding hers. "What is really wrong?" "I do not know what I'm doing," she whispered. "Any of this. How to be a rancher's wife, how to live in this place, how to be married to you." "You are doing fine," he said. "Better than fine. Molly, you have adapted to more change in 1 month than most people face in years. You are allowed to have moments when it is overwhelming. But I am supposed to be strong. You are strong, the strongest person I know. But being strong does not mean never crying or never feeling lost. He reached up to brush tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. And you are not alone in figuring this out. I am just as confused about how to be married to you. I lie awake at night wondering if I did the right thing, asking you to marry me, wondering if you regret it. I do not regret it, Molly said fiercely. Nate, that is not what this is about. Then what is it about? She took a shaky breath. I am starting to have real feelings for you, and that terrifies me because this was supposed to be a marriage of convenience. But it is starting to feel like more than that, and I do not know if that is what you want or if I am just fooling myself. Nate was very still, his gray eyes searching her face. Then slowly he stood and pulled her to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands, those calloused palms gentle against her skin. Molly, I have had real feelings for you since the day I met you. I married you to protect you, yes, but also because I wanted to, because I could not stand the thought of you marrying someone else. I have been trying to be patient, to give you time and space, but every day it gets harder to keep my distance. Every day I fall a little more in love with you. Her breath caught. You love me? I am pretty sure I do. I know it is fast and maybe crazy, but yes. I love you, Molly Zachary. The sound of her married name on his lips, spoken with such tenderness, broke something open in her chest. She rose on her toes and kissed him, properly this time. Not the chaste press of lips from their wedding, but something deeper, hungrier. Nate made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, kissing her back with a passion that had been carefully banked for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Molly said, I love you too. I think I have been falling in love with you for weeks, but I was too afraid to admit it. Do not be afraid, Nate said, resting his forehead against hers. Not of this, not of us. That night, Nate did not sleep on the floor in the main room. They shared the small bedroom, and if they were nervous and fumbling at times, there was also laughter and tenderness and a sense of rightness that made Molly's heart sing. They were husband and wife in truth now, in every sense of the word. The next morning, Molly woke wrapped in Nate's arms, sunlight streaming through the window. She felt different, transformed in some fundamental way. The uncertainty was still there, but now it was joined by certainty. She loved this man. She wanted to build a life with him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Over the following months, their love deepened and grew. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. Nate taught Molly to ride properly, not the side saddle riding of Boston, but real riding, astride and confident. They would ride out together on his days off, exploring the land around the ranch. Molly fell in love with the wildness of Idaho, the vast skies and rugged mountains, the way the light changed across the landscape. She also began to integrate more fully into the community. Her skills improved, and she found she had a knack for the practical challenges of frontier life. She helped Sarah Morrison with various projects, became friends with several of the other ranch wives, and gradually earned respect from the people of Snake River. The scandal of her hasty marriage faded, replaced by recognition that she and Nate were genuinely happy together. Richard Pemberton remained a shadow on the periphery for a while. His bank failed 6 months after their wedding, just as Nate had predicted. Richard left town under cover of night, fleeing his creditors. Molly heard later that he had moved to California, whether to start over or simply run to a new place, she did not know. She felt a strange mixture of pity and relief. Pity for what he had become through his own choices. Relief that she had escaped being dragged down with him. As winter approached, bringing snow and cold that Molly had never experienced in mild Boston, she discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Nate was overjoyed, already planning additions to the cabin, worrying about whether they had enough supplies, being generally overwhelming in his concern. I am not made of glass, Molly laughed one evening as he fussed over whether she should be carrying a pot of water. Women have been having babies for thousands of years. But those women were not my wife, Nate said stubbornly. I am allowed to worry. You are allowed, she agreed, pulling him down for a kiss. But you also need to trust that I will tell you if I need help. Their son was born in early spring, delivered with Sarah Morrison's experienced assistance. Molly labored through the night, Nate pacing anxiously outside until Sarah finally let him in to meet his child. When she placed the baby in his arms, Molly watched her strong, capable husband's eyes fill with tears. "He is perfect," Nate whispered, staring at the tiny face. "You are perfect. You did this, Molly. You brought him into the world." They named him Nathan James, after Nate and Molly's father. Little Nathan proved to be a healthy, lusty baby with a powerful set of lungs. The cabin that had seemed so small at first now felt full and alive with the sounds of family. Life settled into a new rhythm, shaped around the baby's needs. Nate was a devoted father, coming home during breaks to hold his son, walking the floor with him during fussy evenings, marveling at every small development. Molly found motherhood both harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. The exhaustion was real, but so was the fierce love she felt for this tiny person they had created. Jacob Morrison, impressed by Nate's dedication and skill, offered him a partnership in the ranch when Nathan was 6 months old. It would mean investing Molly's money, something they would have to discuss seriously. But Morrison was offering not just a share of the current operation, but land of their own, acreage where they could build a proper house and start their own herd. "What do you think?" Nate asked Molly when he came home with the offer. "It is your money, your choice. I will not pressure you either way." Molly looked around their small cabin, at the life they had built together. She thought about the inheritance she had been so afraid of losing, the money that had made her a target for Richard's schemes. That money had been sitting in the bank, protected but unused, a safety net she had been afraid to touch. "I think my father made that money so his family would have opportunities," she said slowly. "And this is an opportunity, Nate, a chance to build something real, something lasting. I want to do it. I want us to have land of our own, a real home. Let us invest in our future." The joy on Nate's face was answer enough. They drew up the partnership papers carefully, with the lawyer ensuring that Molly's interests were protected, even as they invested a significant portion of her inheritance into the ranch. The land Morrison offered them was beautiful, a valley with a creek running through it, good grazing, and a slight rise where they could build a house with a view of the mountains. They broke ground on the new house that fall, designing it together. It would be larger than the cabin, with separate bedrooms for them and for Nathan. Space to grow as their family potentially grew. Molly insisted on a real kitchen with windows that let in light, and Nate insisted on a wide porch where they could sit together in the evenings. The house took months to build, with Nate and other ranch hands working on it during slower periods. Molly watched it take shape with a sense of profound satisfaction. This was hers and Nate's together, built with their own hands and their combined resources. A partnership in the truest sense. They moved into the new house in early summer, when Nathan was learning to walk. The little boy toddled through the empty rooms, his delighted laughter echoing off the walls. Molly stood in the kitchen, looking out at the land that was theirs now, and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible 2 years ago when she had stepped off that stagecoach. "Happy?" Nate asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "So happy," she said, leaning back against him. "Nate, do you ever think about how different things could have been? If I had married Richard, if you had not offered me an alternative?" "I try not to," he said honestly. "It makes me sick to think about you trapped with that man. But it did not happen. You are here with me, and we have Nathan, and we have this land and this life. That is what matters." She turned in his arms to face him. "I need you to know something. I need you to know that what started as a desperate escape has become the greatest blessing of my life. I did not just fall in love with you, Nate. I built a life with you, and I would choose you again every single day." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring 2 years of love and gratitude into it. When they pulled apart, he was grinning. "Good, because you are stuck with me, Molly Zachary, for better or worse, until death do us part." "I seem to remember agreeing to that," she said lightly, "though I may not have fully understood what I was getting into. A lifetime of early mornings, hard work, and a stubborn cowboy who loves you more than life itself?" "Exactly that," she agreed, "and I would not trade it for anything." Over the next few years, their family grew. 2 more children joined Nathan, first a daughter they named Margaret Rose, and then another son, James Thomas. The house that had seemed so spacious when they built it gradually filled with the chaos and joy of children. Nate proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching his children to ride and rope and respect the land that sustained them. The ranch partnership thrived. Nate and Jacob Morrison worked well together, and the operation expanded, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Molly managed the household and finances with skill, her Boston education serving her well in the practical application of keeping accounts and managing supplies. She also discovered a talent for animal husbandry, developing a particular interest in breeding better cattle stock. Snake River grew from a rough frontier town into a more established community. Molly became involved in efforts to establish a proper school, serving on the committee that raised funds and recruited a teacher. She used some of her remaining inheritance to help build a small schoolhouse, wanting her children and all the children of the community to have access to education. Richard Pemberton became a distant memory, a cautionary tale they occasionally referenced but no longer feared. Molly heard through passing travelers that he had indeed gone to California, where he had apparently reinvented himself as a merchant of some kind. She felt no residual attachment or even curiosity. That chapter of her life was closed, replaced entirely by the rich fullness of her life with Nate. Their 10th wedding anniversary arrived on a morning much like the one when they had first married, clear and bright with promise. Nate had arranged for the children to spend the night with the Morrisons, giving them a rare evening alone. They sat on their porch as the sun set, Nate's arm around Molly's shoulders, both of them watching the play of light across their land. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in town?" Molly asked, when I had overheard Richard talking about his debts. "I said a lot of things that day," Nate replied. "Which part?" "You said that man wants wealth, not you. That he did not see me as a person to be cherished, just a resource to be exploited." Nate's arm tightened around her. "I remember. It made me angrier than I had been in a long time, knowing he was using you like that." "You saw me?" Molly said softly. "From the very beginning, you saw me as a whole person. Not my money, not my social position, just me. That was what I fell in love with first, I think. Being seen." "I will never stop seeing you," Nate promised. "Every day, I look at you and see the brave woman who risked everything on a hasty marriage to a cowboy. The strong woman who adapted to a life so different from what she knew. The loving mother who fills our home with warmth. The partner who built this ranch alongside me. I see all of you, Molly, and I love all of you." Tears pricked her eyes, the good kind that came from overwhelming happiness. "I love you too, so much that sometimes I do not have words for it. You gave me more than escape, Nate. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me a life I love living. We gave it to each other," he corrected gently. "This is ours, built together." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the house, their home, evidence of their life together was everywhere. Children's toys in a basket by the door, books on shelves Nate had built, photographs and frames on the walls, capturing moments of their growing family. Quilts Molly had made, curtains she had sewn, furniture they had purchased together, piece by piece, as they could afford it. "I want you to know something," Nate said eventually. "I know we got married for practical reasons, to save you from Pemberton. But Molly, I would marry you again tomorrow for no reason other than I love you and want to spend my life with you. Every day with you has been a gift I never expected to receive." "Then we are even," Molly said, turning to kiss him. "Because I feel exactly the same way." As they went inside together, hands linked, Molly thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 10 years ago. She had been so lost then, grieving her father, trapped in an engagement to a man who saw her as a commodity. She had thought she was traveling to Idaho to fulfill an obligation, to do what was expected of her. Instead, she had found freedom. She had found love, she had found herself, and she had found Nate Zachary, the cowboy with riverstone eyes who had looked at her and seen not wealth, but worth, who had offered her honesty when everyone else in her life had offered deception, who had given her the choice to build something real instead of settling for something hollow. Their children came home the next morning, bursting with energy and stories about their night with the Morrisons. Nathan, now 10 years old and already showing signs of his father's height and steady nature, helped Nate with morning chores. Margaret, 8 years old and fearless, begged her mother to let her help with baking. James, at 6, was a whirlwind of constant questions and boundless curiosity. Molly stood in her kitchen, flour on her hands from helping Margaret with biscuits, and listened to Nate's patient voice outside, explaining something to Nathan. Through the window, she could see James chasing the barn cat with more enthusiasm than skill. This was her life. Messy, loud, unpredictable, and absolutely perfect. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, Molly found the letter she had written to Richard all those years ago. The one explaining that she could not marry him. She had kept it tucked in her writing desk, a reminder of the path not taken. Now, she carried it to the kitchen stove and fed it to the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear. "What was that?" Nate asked, coming in from checking the horses. "The past," Molly said simply. "I do not need it anymore." Nate understood, as he always did. He pulled her close, and they stood together watching the fire through the stove grate, the letter reducing to ash and memory. The years continued to roll forward, bringing changes and challenges as all lives do. There were hard winters that tested their endurance, dry summers that made every drop of water precious. There were sick children who needed nursing through fevers, and injuries that came from working with animals and land. There were disagreements because no marriage is without conflict, but they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise, to remember that they were on the same side. There were also abundant joys, watching their children grow and develop into their own people. Nathan proving to have his father's gift with horses and his mother's head for numbers. Margaret showing artistic talent, filling pages with drawings of the land and animals around them. James discovering a love of reading, devouring every book they could get their hands on. The ranch continued to prosper. When Jacob Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at 75, his wife Sarah chose to move to Boise to live with her sister, selling her share of the ranch to Nate and Molly. It was bittersweet, losing friends who had been so instrumental in their lives, but it also meant the ranch was fully theirs, a legacy they could pass to their children. Idaho achieved statehood in 1890, and Snake River celebrated with a festival that brought people from throughout the region. Molly, at 30 years old, looked around at the community she had helped build and felt pride in what they had all accomplished together. The rough frontier town had become a real place, with schools and churches and businesses, with families putting down roots and building futures. As their children reached adolescence and young adulthood, Molly and Nate found themselves entering a new phase of life. Nathan, at 18, was already a skilled rancher, taking on more and more responsibility. Margaret, at 16, was developing into a remarkable young woman, her art gaining attention even beyond Snake River. James, at 14, was talking about possibly becoming a teacher someday, inspired by the education Molly had worked so hard to bring to their community. On a cool autumn evening, with the children occupied with their own pursuits, Molly and Nate took a rare ride out to the spot where they had first decided to build their house. The view was just as breathtaking as it had been all those years ago, the mountains purple in the fading light, the creek glinting like silver ribbon through the valley. "We have done well, have we not?" Nate said, dismounting and helping Molly down from her horse. "Look at what we built." "We have," Molly agreed, looking not just at the physical structures, but at the life they had created. "Nate, do you ever regret offering to marry me that day? Taking on a frightened Boston heiress and all the complications that came with her?" He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands the way he had the first night she had admitted her feelings for him. His hair was starting to gray at the temples now. Lines had formed around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to Molly, he was just as handsome as the day they met. More so, because now she knew the depth of the man behind that handsome face. "Not for one single second," he said firmly. "Molly, you were never a complication. You were a revelation. You showed me what love could be, what partnership meant. You took my simple life and made it extraordinary. If I could go back to that day, knowing everything that would come, I would not change a single thing. I would still offer, and I would still hope, against all logic, that you would say yes." "I would say yes every time," Molly whispered. "In every lifetime, in every version of this story, I would choose you, Nate Zachary." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains. Two people who had started as strangers bound by desperation and circumstance, who had built something rare and precious through honesty, respect, and love. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "We should get back," Nate said reluctantly. "Margaret will have dinner ready, and you know how she gets if we are late." "She gets that from you," Molly teased. "You are far more particular about mealtimes than I ever was." "I am a growing man," Nate protested with mock seriousness. "I need regular sustenance." They rode back to the house together as night fell, comfortable in the silence that came from years of companionship. The house was glowing with lamplight, smoke rising from the chimney, and as they approached, they could hear laughter from inside. Their family, their home, their life. Molly had left Boston as a young woman seeking a safe, suitable marriage to a respectable man. Instead, she had found a great love with a cowboy who had offered her honesty when everyone else offered deception. She had found a home in the wild Idaho land. She had found herself. And standing in the barn, as Nate tended to the horses, watching him work with the easy competence born of years of practice, Molly felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Richard Pemberton had wanted her wealth. But Nate Zachary had wanted her, all of her strength and weakness, her fears and hopes, her past and her future. That had made all the difference. Nathan burst into the barn then, breathless and excited. "Papa, Mama, you have to come quick. James is trying to teach Margaret's cat to fetch, and it is not going well." Nate caught Molly's eye, and they both started laughing. This was their life now, full of small dramas and everyday joys, far from the schemes and deceptions of wealthy bankers, far from the hollow propriety of Boston society. It was real and messy and wonderful. "We better go rescue that cat," Nate said, taking Molly's hand. "And possibly James," Molly added. They walked together back to the house, Nathan running ahead to rejoin the chaos inside. At the door, Nate paused and pulled Molly close one more time. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For trusting me. For taking a chance on a cowboy you barely knew. For building this life with me. For loving me." "Thank you for seeing me," Molly replied. "For understanding that I was worth more than my bank account. For giving me the freedom to choose and then honoring that choice every single day since." Inside, they could hear raised voices and laughter, the sounds of their children and their life together. Nate kissed her forehead, then her lips, then opened the door. Light and warmth spilled out, and they stepped inside together, ready for whatever small adventures the evening would bring. Years later, when their children had children of their own, when Molly and Nate were grandparents with silver hair and weathered faces, they would still sit on their porch in the evenings. They would hold hands and watch the sunset over the land they had built their life on, and they would remember. They would remember a desperate young woman and a kind cowboy. They would remember a hasty wedding at dawn and legal papers protecting an inheritance. They would remember Richard Pemberton's schemes and the moment when everything changed with 6 simple words spoken in truth and love. "That man wants wealth, not you." Those words had been a revelation and a promise that Nate kept every day of their life together, showing Molly through action and word that he valued her, not her money, that he loved her, not what she could provide. And in the end, that made all the difference between a life lived in fear and obligation and a life lived in love and freedom, between a marriage that was merely a transaction and a marriage that was a true partnership in every sense. Molly Zachary, née Owens, had come west seeking a new beginning. She had found that and so much more. She had found home. She had found family. She had found herself. But most importantly, she had found love. Real, honest, abiding love with a man who saw her true worth from the very first day. And that, she would think in quiet moments, was the greatest fortune of all.